The jungle had a way of holding on to time. Even decades later, the air felt the same, thick, unmoving, as if nothing beyond the trees had ever changed. Leaves gathered and fell in quiet cycles, the ground softened by years of decay, and somewhere in the distance, water moved slowly over stone. It was a place where the past did not feel distant. It lingered. It waited. And somewhere within it, a soldier still believed the war had not ended. He moved carefully, as he always had, each step deliberate, measured against the soft resistance of the forest floor. His clothes, worn and repaired countless times, blended into the earth around him. His rifle rested in his hands with the familiarity of something that had long since become part of him. No longer an object, but an extension of purpose. There were no voices here, no commands, no signals. And yet, he continued, it had not begun this way. Years earlier, the jungle had sounded different, louder, alive with urgency. Aircraft had passed overhead in restless patterns, their distant hum pressing down against the trees. The ground had carried vibrations that could be felt before they were heard, movements of men, of machines, of something large and approaching. Orders had come quickly then, sometimes contradicting each other, sometimes arriving too late. There had been little time to question them, only to follow. He had been younger, not by much, but enough that the weight of uncertainty had not yet settled into him, enough that he still believed clarity would come, that the chaos surrounding him was temporary, that somewhere beyond the dense green horizon, someone understood what was happening. But clarity never came. Instead, the days had grown more uncertain. Messages stopped arriving. Familiar faces disappeared one by one, sometimes without explanation. The structure that had once held everything together began to loosen, then fracture, then vanish entirely. What remained were fragments. Fragments of orders. Fragments of expectation. And one instruction that for him never faded. Do not surrender. Do not believe what the enemy tells you. Wait. It had been delivered without emphasis, almost casually, as if it were one instruction among many. But in the absence of everything else, it became the only one that mattered. At first, he had not been alone. There were others in those early days after the silence fell. Men who moved through the jungle with the same uncertainty, the same cautious discipline. They spoke in low voices, conserving not just sound, but something deeper. Confidence, perhaps, or belief. They waited together. Days passed, then weeks. The expected return never came. No reinforcements. No clear sign of victory or defeat. Only the jungle, unchanged, indifferent. And then, slowly, even that began to change. Some of the others started to question. Not loudly, not directly, but in the way they looked at distant plains that no longer carried the same urgency, or in the way they lingered over objects left behind. Packaging, scraps, things that did not quite match what they remembered. Leaflets appeared one day, scattered across the ground like fallen leaves. They were printed cleanly, the text sharp and clear in a way that felt almost unnatural against the roughness of the jungle. They spoke of surrender, of an end. The war, they said, was over. He had read them carefully, more than once, tracing the words as if repetition might reveal something hidden beneath them. But the instruction remained clear in his mind. Do not believe what the enemy tells you. The others reacted differently. Some dismissed the leaflets immediately, their skepticism firm and unshaken. Others hesitated. The possibility once introduced could not be fully ignored. It lingered in their thoughts, creating small fractures in what had once been certainty. The group began to thin. One man left first. He said little, only that he would try to confirm the truth. He did not return. Another followed weeks later, less certain, more conflicted. He paused longer before leaving, as if waiting for something to stop him. Nothing did. Soon there were only a few remaining, and then, eventually, only one. The jungle grew quieter after that. Without voices, without shared routines, the days took on a different shape. Time no longer moved in clear segments marked by conversation or coordinated action. It stretched, blurred, folded into itself. He adapted. At first it was practical. Survival required structure, even in isolation. He found ways to gather food, to maintain his equipment, to move without leaving traces. Each task was performed with care, with repetition, until it became automatic. Routine replaced command. Morning began with inspection of surroundings, of supplies, of the weapon that still defined his purpose. Movement followed patterns, not because they were ordered, but because they reduced risk. Every action had a reason, even if the larger reason for being there had begun to fade at the edges, but he did not allow it to disappear. When doubt surfaced, and it did, quietly, without warning, he returned to the instruction. Do not surrender, do not believe. Wait. Waiting became something else over time. It was no longer passive. It required effort, discipline, a constant rejection of what seemed increasingly possible. There were moments when the outside world intruded, distant sounds that did not match anything he recognized. The faint echo of voices carried unnaturally through the trees, objects found in places where no one should have been. Modern, unfamiliar, out of place. Each one presented a question, and each time he answered it the same way. Deception. The enemy had changed tactics, that was all. They had grown more subtle, more patient, but the goal remained the same: to make him stop, to make him believe the war had ended. He adjusted accordingly. Avoidance became instinct. Observation replaced movement when uncertainty grew too strong. He watched from a distance, studied patterns, waited for inconsistencies that would confirm what he already believed. And sometimes he found them, small details that did not align, behaviors that felt rehearsed, signs that to him confirmed the deception. It was enough. The years passed, though he no longer measured them clearly. His reflection, when he occasionally caught it in still water, changed slowly. Lines deepened. Movements became more deliberate, conserving energy in ways he did not consciously recognize. But his purpose did not change. It could not. Because if it did, then everything that had come before, the waiting, the isolation, the quiet resistance, would lose its meaning. And that was something he could not allow. So he remained. hidden within the jungle, moving through it as if he had always belonged there, carrying a war that no longer existed beyond the boundaries of his belief. Somewhere, far beyond the trees, the world had moved on. Cities had been rebuilt. Lives had continued. The war had been written into history, its ending marked and recorded. But none of that reached him. Not fully, not in a way he could accept. Because for him, the war had not ended. It had simply become quieter. And in that quiet, something else began to take shape. Not doubt, not yet, but something close to it. A question that did not have a clear answer. If the war was still being fought, why did it feel so empty? At first, survival had been an extension of duty. Each movement, each decision had carried the same quiet urgency that once defined the battlefield. The jungle was not a place of refuge, but an extension of it. Another front, another terrain to be navigated with care. Every sound mattered. Every absence of sound mattered even more. But as the days lengthened and folded into one another, something began to shift. The urgency did not disappear. It softened. In its place, a slower rhythm emerged, one shaped less by immediate danger and more by endurance. He began to move not just to avoid being seen, but to exist within the jungle itself, learning its patterns the way one might learn the habits of a silent companion. Water was no longer something found by chance. It became predictable, traced through memory and careful observation. Food, once uncertain, revealed itself in small consistencies. Fruit that returned in cycles, animals that followed quiet paths through the undergrowth. Even the light, filtered through layers of leaves, became something he could read, marking time in a world where time had otherwise dissolved. He built shelter, though it was never meant to be permanent. Nothing was. The structure was simple, hidden beneath layers of foliage, designed to disappear as easily as it had been made. He repaired it often, not because it was failing, but because repetition gave shape to his days. The act itself became necessary, a way to hold on to order in a place where nothing else remained fixed. His rifle remained constant. It was cleaned each morning with the same precision, the same attention to detail that had once been expected of him. Even when there had been no sign of conflict for weeks, then months, he continued. Not out of habit alone, but because to neglect it would mean accepting something he was not ready to accept. That the war might truly be over. So he did not allow that thought to settle. Instead, he reinforced the world as he understood it. The enemy was still present. They had simply changed. This belief found support in the small interruptions that continued to appear, as if the outside world was testing the edges of his isolation. Leaflets returned, sometimes carried by the wind, sometimes dropped in careful patterns that suggested intention. The messages were consistent, though the details shifted slightly over time. They spoke of surrender, of peace, of a world that had moved beyond conflict. He studied them with the same attention he gave everything else. The paper was too clean, the language too direct. There was something about them that felt constructed, as if they were designed not to inform, but to persuade. He burned them when he was finished. Not out of anger, but to remove their presence, to prevent them from lingering. Once he found a radio. It had been left near a clearing, positioned in a way that suggested it was meant to be discovered. He approached it slowly, observing from a distance for hours before allowing himself to move closer. Even then, he did not touch it immediately. When he finally did, it felt unfamiliar in his hands. The sounds it produced were clearer than he expected, voices speaking in calm, measured tones. They did not sound like the enemy he remembered. There was no urgency, no aggression, only information. News of places he did not recognize, names that held no meaning, occasional references to the war, but always in the past tense. He listened for a long time, long enough that the edges of doubt began to form, faint but undeniable. Then he turned it off and left it behind. It was too convenient, too carefully placed. Another attempt, another deception. He returned to the jungle, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Time continued to move, though not in ways that could be easily measured. The seasons, if they could be called that, shifted subtly. Rain came and went in patterns that he began to anticipate. The air thickened, then lightened. The jungle breathed, and he adjusted with it. But something else began to change. The sense of waiting, which had once been sharp and defined, began to lose its edges, did not disappear, but it no longer pointed toward anything specific. There was no longer an expectation of rescue or of new orders arriving to restore clarity. Waiting became something quieter, a state of being rather than an action. He no longer thought in terms of days or months. Instead, he marked time through repetition, through the number of times he had repaired his shelter, the number of times he had walked the same path without encountering anything new. And yet, the world continued to intrude. Footprints appeared once, near the edge of a stream he visited often. They were fresh, too precise to be mistaken for anything natural. He crouched beside them, studying their shape, their depth, the direction they moved. They did not belong to him. He followed them for a short distance, then stopped. To continue would mean revealing himself. And if they were enemy, that was a risk he could not take. Instead, he watched. From a distance hidden within the layers of green, he observed movement that confirmed what he already suspected. People passed through the area, speaking in low voices, carrying objects that reflected light in unfamiliar ways. They did not search. They did not move like soldiers, which made them more dangerous. He adjusted his movements after that. Paths were changed, patterns broken and reformed. He became more careful, more deliberate, as if the jungle itself had begun to shift around him. And still, he held to the instruction: do not surrender, do not believe. Wait. There were moments, though, when the weight of those words pressed differently, not as guidance, but as something heavier, something that required effort to carry. At night, when the jungle settled into its quieter rhythms, he sometimes found himself listening for something that never came. Not movement, not threat, but a signal, a confirmation that what he was doing still mattered in the way it once had. None came, only the distant sounds of the forest, unchanged, indifferent. He began to speak less, even to himself. Words felt unnecessary. There was no one to hear them, no need to give shape to thoughts that could remain unspoken. Silence became natural, not just around him, but within him. And in that silence, something subtle began to take form, not doubt, not fully, but a question. It surfaced rarely and never stayed long. He pushed it aside each time it appeared, returning to routine, to action, to anything that would anchor him. But it returned. In the quiet moments between movement and stillness, in the space between one day and the next. If the war was still being fought, why did no one come? The question did not change his actions. He continued as he always had, moving carefully, maintaining his routine, reinforcing the world as he understood it. But something had shifted. The certainty that once held everything together was no longer absolute. It had not broken, but it had begun to bend. And somewhere within that quiet, unseen change, the first real fracture had begun to form. The change did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, almost gently, as if the world itself were hesitant to disturb what had already endured for so long. There was no single moment when everything shifted, no clear dividing line between what had been and what was beginning to take shape. Instead, it unfolded in small, quiet ways, details that did not belong, patterns that no longer repeated as they once had. At first, he treated these changes as he had treated everything else, with caution, with discipline, with the steady belief that there was always an explanation, even if it was not immediately visible. But the explanations began to require more effort. The jungle, once predictable in its rhythms, seemed to carry interruptions that could not be easily dismissed. Sounds traveled differently now. Distant echoes lingered longer than they should have, carrying fragments of voices that felt too clear, too close, and yet never fully present. He would pause when he heard them, lowering himself into stillness, listening with a focus that bordered on strain. Nothing followed. No movement, no approach. Only the lingering impression that something had been there, just beyond reach. He told himself it was deliberate, a tactic. The enemy had grown patient. That was the only way to understand it. And yet patience required purpose. It required continuation. It required something to be gained. The longer he remained, the less that purpose revealed itself. Time, which had once dissolved into repetition, began to take on a different weight. It did not move faster or slower. It simply became more noticeable. Each day carried the quiet accumulation of the ones before it, layering into something that could no longer be ignored. He began to mark it again, not with certainty, but with approximation. Scratches made into wood, small notations that attempted to give shape to something that resisted it. At first, the marks were precise, evenly spaced, a continuation of the discipline he had maintained for so long. But over time, they lost their consistency. Some days passed without marking. Others were marked twice, as if to compensate for what had been missed. The system, like everything else, began to loosen. He noticed it, and he tried to correct it, but correction required clarity, and clarity was no longer something he could fully hold on to. The jungle had not changed. That was what made it difficult. The trees still stood where they always had. The paths he had carved through memory remained intact. The streams flowed with the same quiet persistence. There was no visible shift, no obvious transformation that could explain the growing sense that something was no longer aligned. The change was not in the world. It was in how the world was being understood. He began to encounter things that could not be easily placed within the framework he had built. A piece of fabric, bright in color, unlike anything he had seen before, caught on a branch along one of his paths. It did not belong to any uniform he recognized. It did not match anything from the past. It was new. He held it for a long time, turning it over in his hands, studying its texture, its construction. It felt manufactured in a way that was unfamiliar, smoother, more refined. He tried to place it, to assign it a purpose that would make sense within the world he knew, but nothing fit. Eventually, he left it behind, not because it was unimportant, but because it was too difficult to carry. There were other signs, footprints that appeared and disappeared without pattern, objects left in places that suggested intention but without follow-through. Once, he found a cooking fire still warm, its embers faintly glowing beneath a layer of ash. He waited nearby, hidden, watching for whoever had made it. No one returned. Hours passed, then more. The fire cooled, and the absence remained. He began to consider possibilities he had not allowed himself to consider before, not as conclusions, but as questions. If the enemy was still present, why were they not searching? If they were trying to deceive him, why had the attempts become so inconsistent? If the war was still being fought, where was the conflict? These questions did not arrive all at once. They surfaced slowly, each one carrying a weight that lingered longer than the last. He did not accept them. He did not allow them to settle fully, but he could no longer dismiss them as easily. The instruction remained, do not surrender, do not believe. Wait. but the space around those words had changed. They were no longer supported by the same certainty. They stood alone now, without reinforcement, without confirmation. He repeated them, not just to remember, but to hold them in place, because without them, there would be nothing left to hold on to. His movements became more cautious, but not in the way they had been before. It was no longer just about avoiding the enemy. It was about avoiding uncertainty. He stayed closer to familiar paths, limited his range, reduced the variables he had to account for. The jungle, once something he had moved through with quiet confidence, became something narrower, more contained, safer. And yet, even within that containment, the questions remained. They followed him into the routines he had built, slipping into the spaces between actions. When he cleaned his rifle, when he repaired his shelter, when he sat in stillness listening to the distant sounds of the forest. They were there, unanswered, unresolved, and growing. The loneliness deepened, though he did not name it as such. It manifested in subtler ways, in the way he lingered longer at the edge of clearings as if expecting something to appear, in the way he listened not just for movement, but for voices that would confirm he was not entirely alone in what he still believed. None came. Or if they did not remain. There had once been others. Their absence had been gradual but complete. Now, even the memory of them felt distant, as if it belonged to a different version of time. Their voices, their presence, their shared certainty, it had all faded into something less defined. He was no longer part of a group waiting. He was simply the one who had not stopped. And that distinction, though subtle, carried weight, because it meant that whatever the truth was, whatever had happened beyond the jungle, it had not included him. The realization did not arrive fully formed. It moved slowly, like everything else, taking shape in fragments that did not immediately connect. But when they did, even briefly, they revealed something difficult to ignore. The world, whatever it had become, was continuing without him. He did not accept this. He could not. To accept it would mean acknowledging that the years he had spent holding to his orders, to his belief, had not been part of an ongoing struggle, but something else entirely, something that no longer had a place. So he resisted. He returned to the structure he knew, reinforced his routines, repeated the instruction more frequently, as if doing so could restore the certainty that had begun to fade. And for a time, it worked. The questions quieted. The world narrowed again. But not completely, because once something has been considered, even briefly, it cannot be entirely forgotten. It remains, waiting. And in the quiet that followed, as the jungle settled into its familiar stillness, another thought began to take shape. One that felt heavier than the others, more difficult to push aside. If the war had truly ended, Then what had all of this been for? The first time he saw him, he thought it was another attempt. The figure stepped into the clearing without hesitation, moving in a way that felt almost out of place within the jungle. There was no tension in his posture, no careful scanning of the trees, no awareness of danger in the way a soldier would carry himself. He walked as if the forest were not something to survive, but simply something to pass through, and that alone made him difficult to understand. The soldier remained hidden, lowered into stillness, watching with the quiet discipline that had defined his life for so many years. He had seen attempts before, objects left behind, voices carried too clearly, messages designed to sound convincing. This felt like one of them, another layer of deception meant to unsettle him, to make him step out before he was ready. So he stayed where he was, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption, studying every detail, waiting for the inconsistency that would reveal the truth. The man stopped in the center of the clearing and stood there in silence for a long time, as if he understood that rushing would break something fragile. When he finally spoke, it was not loudly, not like a command, but with a quiet steadiness that carried just enough to reach the edges of the trees. He said a name. The soldier felt it immediately, not as recognition, but as disturbance. Names could be known. Names could be used. He did not respond. The man repeated it softer this time, as if testing whether it had been heard, then waited again. Nothing followed. No movement, no approach, only the stillness of the jungle holding both of them in place. The soldier tightened his focus, searching for patterns, for anything that would confirm what he already believed. The man's clothing was unfamiliar, lighter, less structured than anything designed for war, and that only added to the sense that something was wrong, that this did not belong. Slowly the man reached into the bag at his side and removed a photograph, holding it out toward the empty space between them. Even from a distance, the soldier recognized what it was, though not yet what it contained. The gesture was careful, almost respectful, as if it were being offered rather than presented. "You were told to wait," the man said quietly, and the words settled into the air with a weight that felt too precise to ignore. The soldier did not move, but something shifted beneath the surface of his stillness, something he could not immediately place. The sentence aligned too closely with what he had carried for so long, with the instruction that had guided everything he had done. It could still be a tactic. It had to be. When the man spoke again, saying that the war had ended long ago, the familiarity of the words made them easier to reject. He had heard them before in different forms, and each time they had been nothing more than an attempt to make him stop. This would be no different. But the man did not leave. He remained in the clearing with a patience that did not feel like strategy, and after some time, he reached into his bag again and placed several folded newspapers on the ground before stepping back. There was no urgency in the movement, no demand for a response, only the quiet suggestion that they could be taken or ignored. The soldier watched for a long time, longer than he intended, as if waiting for something to reveal itself. The instinct to retreat was still there, strong and familiar, but the questions that had begun to form over time had not disappeared, and now they had something to attach to. He shifted slightly, just enough to change his angle of view, and the man noticed but did not react, lowering the photograph slightly, as if acknowledging the movement without pressing it further. "I'm not here to fight you," he said, and the words, simple as they were, carried a kind of steadiness that did not fit with the idea of an enemy. The soldier moved forward, not fully, not openly, but enough to bring the details into focus. The photograph came first. The face within it was older than he remembered, shaped by time in a way that felt unfamiliar, but there was no mistaking it. A superior officer, the one who had given the order that had remained when everything else had disappeared. The memory of that moment returned with clarity, sharper than anything else he had held on to, and for a brief instant it felt as though nothing had changed. Then his attention shifted to the newspapers. The paper was thinner, the print denser, the arrangement of information unfamiliar, and the dates, he lingered on the dates, extended far beyond what he expected. Years that should not have passed, events that should not have unfolded. The war was there, but not as something continuing. It was described as something finished, something already concluded, its ending fixed in a way that did not leave room for doubt. The ground beneath him remained steady, unchanged, but the structure he had built within himself did not hold in the same way. It did not collapse all at once, nor did it break with any sudden force. Instead, it loosened slowly, as if the connections that had once held everything together were no longer strong enough to remain in place. The man in the clearing did not speak again, allowing the silence to stretch, giving space for the realization to take shape on its own. The soldier lowered himself slightly, no longer fully hidden, his rifle still in his hands, but no longer held with the same certainty. The weight of it had not changed, but its purpose had, and that difference, though subtle, could not be ignored. He looked again at the photograph, then at the newspapers, and finally at the man. And for the first time in years, the instruction did not come to him with the same force. The war had ended, not recently, not quietly, but completely, and he had remained, holding on to something that no longer existed beyond his own belief. He did not drop his weapon, and he did not step fully into the clearing, but something had already shifted in a way that could not be reversed. The certainty that had carried him through the jungle, through the silence, through the endless repetition of days was gone, replaced by something heavier, something that did not bring relief, only understanding. He looked at the man once more, no longer seeing an enemy, only someone who had come from a world that had continued without him. And as that realization settled fully into place, quiet and undeniable, a single thought remained, steady and impossible to ignore. If the war was truly over, Then who had he been all this time? The world did not rush to meet him. When he stepped beyond the edges of the jungle, the change came slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the land itself were unsure how to release him. The dense layers of trees did not end all at once, but thinned gradually, their shadows breaking apart into open space that felt unfamiliar in its clarity. He moved forward with the same careful rhythm he had carried for years, each step deliberate, measured against ground that no longer needed to be read so closely. Nothing in him yet understood that the danger had passed. The habits remained, even when the reason for them had begun to fade. The man walked ahead of him, not guiding, not instructing, simply present in a way that required nothing in return. There were no commands, no expectations placed on him, and that absence felt heavier than anything he had experienced in isolation. For so long, his world had been defined by what must be done, by what must be avoided, by what must be believed. Now, there was only movement without direction, and he followed it not out of obedience, but because there was nothing else to follow. The first road he saw did not feel real. It stretched across the land with a smoothness that seemed unnatural, its surface unbroken, extending into a distance that did not disappear into uncertainty, but remained visible, steady, fixed. He stopped at its edge and looked down at it, as if expecting it to reveal something hidden beneath its stillness. It did not. The jungle had always responded in subtle ways. The shifting of leaves, the movement of air, the quiet presence of life even in stillness. This did not respond, it simply existed, unchanged, without movement or breath. Then came the sounds. They were sharper than anything he had known before, carrying clearly across distance, without distortion. Engines moved somewhere beyond his sight, their steady hum unlike anything in the forest. Voices followed, not quiet, not cautious, but open, unguarded, as if there were nothing to fear in being heard. Each sound reached him with a clarity that made it difficult to place, and his body responded without thought, turning slightly, searching for patterns, for danger, for something familiar within it, but nothing followed. There was no urgency in the noise, no signal of threat, only continuation. People appeared. They moved without hesitation, without awareness of concealment or risk. Their steps were unmeasured, their attention directed outward rather than toward survival. They passed along the road and through the open space with a kind of ease that felt impossible to understand. When they noticed him, their movement slowed, but not with fear. They looked at him with something quieter, something closer to curiosity, as if he were something out of place, something that did not belong within the world they moved through so naturally. He did not speak. There were no words that could bridge the distance between what he had been and what they were. Language, which had once been functional, tied to orders and communication, felt unnecessary now, insufficient. He stood in silence, his presence defined not by expression, but by what remained within him. The stillness, the years, the absence of everything that had continued beyond the jungle. They gave him new clothes. He accepted them without resistance, though they felt unfamiliar against his skin, lighter in a way that did not bring comfort. The fabric did not carry the same weight, the same resistance, the same connection to the environment he had known. When he looked down at himself, he did not recognize what he saw. The uniform that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something that held no meaning, no history. And yet, beneath it, nothing had changed. The soldier was still there, only without a place to exist. The weapon was taken from him, not forcibly, not with tension, but with a quiet understanding that it was no longer needed. He released it without hesitation, but the absence of its weight lingered in a way that could not be easily explained. It had been more than an object. It had been continuity, a constant presence through years that had otherwise lost their shape. Without it, his hands felt empty, not just physically, but in a way that extended deeper into something less defined. They spoke to him. Their words were calm, measured, explaining things that felt both simple and impossible. The war had ended decades ago. The world had changed. Nations had rebuilt. Lives had continued. Time had moved forward without pause. Everything he had held on to had been left behind, not intentionally, but inevitably. He listened, understanding the words as they were spoken, but understanding them did not mean he could accept them fully. Acceptance required something else. It required letting go of what had carried him through the years. And letting go was not simple. It was not only time that had been lost, though the years pressed against him in ways he could not fully measure. It was purpose. The structure that had defined every movement, every decision, every thought. It was gone. Not replaced, not transformed, simply absent. He had been a soldier, and that had been enough. Now there was no clear definition, no instruction to follow, no reason to move in one direction rather than another. He walked sometimes without destination. The world around him continued in ways that did not require his participation. People passed by, their lives unfolding with a rhythm he could not enter, and he observed them with a quiet detachment that was neither curiosity nor indifference, but something in between. They spoke, laughed, moved with intention, and all of it existed without him, just as it had for years beyond the jungle. Time moved differently here. It was no longer something to endure or lose track of. It was visible, structured, divided into moments that carried their own weight. And yet for him it felt unfamiliar, difficult to hold on to. The years he had spent waiting had not prepared him for this kind of movement, this kind of continuity. he began to remember more. Not just the war, but the life that had come before it. Fragments surfaced quietly. Faces, places, moments that had once felt distant, but now returned with a kind of clarity that was difficult to place. They belonged to him, and yet they did not fully connect to the present. They existed as something separate, something that had ended long before he stepped out of the jungle. He stood between two worlds. The jungle, with its silence and structure, remained behind him, unchanged, continuing without him. And this new world, with its movement and clarity, continued forward without hesitation. He did not fully belong to either. He carried one within him while standing in the other, unable to return, unable to fully arrive. He did not go back. But the jungle did not leave him. It remained in the way he moved, in the way he listened, in the stillness he carried, even when surrounded by sound. It remained as a place that had once made sense, a place where every action had meaning, even if that meaning had been built on something that was no longer real. And now that meaning was gone, not replaced, just gone. In the quiet moments when the world slowed enough for thought to settle, he found himself returning to the question that had followed him out of the trees, the one that had taken shape as everything he believed began to loosen. If the war had truly ended, then what had all of it been for? There was no answer, only time, continuing as it always had, moving forward without pause, carrying him into something that did not yet have a name, while behind him, far beyond where he now stood, the jungle remained, still, patient, unchanged, holding within it the quiet memory of a war that, for one man, had never truly ended.